Got it.
Perfect.
Yep.
All right. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us for our monthly free webinar. Language Dynamics Group offers free webinars every month, with the exception of 1 month that we'll take a break, and that will be in June this year. Tonight's webinar topic is going to be about research, what we know about assessing and teaching reading related skills, so language, reading fluency. We're going to cover a lot today. And all of the studies are related to the tools that we have produced, right, for you. So through the research. So I'm going to update you on kind of what we know, what we need to continue to research, and then what we are currently doing. We'll provide a copy of the slides to you in a follow-up email. If you're watching this recording, there'll be a link to the certificate at the end. And then do pay attention, because in order to receive a certificate of attendance for any CEs or continuing education units, as applicable, that's up to you to realize or decide whether or not this applies or can be used. I do know for ASHA CEs, to maintain your CCCs, I think it's like a PDH hour if you complete the certificate. And then for BACB CEUs, it'll be 1. But my name is Dr. Megan Kirby. I'm the director of our dissemination implementation programs at Language Dynamics Group. Lovely Christy Jones is on tonight to help us with the chat and kind of moderate the webinar. And so she will be available. She is also one of our dissemination implementation specialists. It's one of 2 of us. So without further ado, let me kind of go over what we're going to talk about in this webinar. I'll give a brief introduction to who we are as an organization. I think that's important. Then a little bit of research, just 2 studies about the cubed. I'll go into 1 study that came out, was recently published, about the diamond, which is our new DLD and like dyslexia diagnostic assessment. We'll go into research about story champs. There's a bunch, and I think I even forgot one of the articles to include tonight. Then we'll briefly talk about what's in the research to practice pipeline. What do we have going on? If you're interested in becoming a research partner, kind of how do you go about doing that? And then I'll provide information for the webinar certificate at the end. Here are the people that run LDG, or behind the scenes, and the founders are going to be Trina and Doug and Roger here. And then supplemented and other co-owners. Olivia Peterson is our graphic designer, and we've got Shane, who runs and operates sales. So if you've ever emailed sales or the information address at our website, probably interacted with him. I don't have Mike up here. He will also be Shane's counterpart. Then we have folks like Christy and Cameron, who are dissemination implementation specialists. And then we have the folks that work in the warehouse, Karen and Roger's children. And again, we are missing 2 people. I think we now have like an administrative assistant, Kathy. And yeah, this is missing Mike. Go figure. I love what we do. We now have 4. Instead of a trifecta, we've got this group, this solid base of tools. We call them products if you're on the sales, but as researchers, we like calling them tools. The cubed, the pearl, the diamond, and story champs, right? And how they fit together is going to be all about assessment. So we've got the universal benchmarking and progress monitoring system. That's the cubed. The kindergarten, end of preschool, kindergarten screener, it's a universal screener, is going to be the pearl. And then the diamond is our new diagnostic tool for DLD and dyslexia. And I'll go over that in depth. Then once you have identified a problem, what do you do about it? That's story champs and related products with it. So first, we'll start off with the Cubed 3 research that has come out specifically in the past year or so. I think I put the start date as like December 2023, but all of 2024, and then through publications through March 2025, and then I cut us off because I know something just recently came out. We'll save that for next year or the end of the year. So if you're interested, you don't know anything about the cubed, this is our benchmarking and progress monitoring tool. There is a digital format or a digital tool that goes along with the cubed assessments. It's wonderful, makes things easier. You can scan that QR code and get more information about it since we're limited in time. But we're going to jump right into the first study. I wish I had a drum roll. So this came out. This is our first, the earliest one that was published in this time frame that I looked at. So the end of 2023, there was an article that was published called Reliability and Validity Evidence for the English and the Spanish preschool NLM listening forms, so narrative language measures. This is a snapshot of what it looks like. The preschool Spanish forms have illustrations. The English and Spanish forms are equivalent, right? So they've been reverse translated. So forwards translation, so English to Spanish, and backwards translation, which is then taking that Spanish translation and translating it back into English and seeing how close they match. This is why it's so hard to get assessments translated into new languages, because that back and forth is, one, really expensive, right? You need to pay people for their time. And then two, it takes a lot of time, and you find out that there's really some gaps. People may say they're fluent in a language and they're not. So you've got to have native English speakers and writers involved in the research team. Then you need to test it, right? So these forms were given to preschoolers, and it was 126 3 and 4-year-olds. They were in a Head Start preschool in the Southwest US, so a Southwestern state in the United States. There are 65 children who were administered the English forms, and then 61 children were administered the Spanish forms. The makeup or demographics of the study included over half that were Latino or Hispanic students, or identified as such, and then 22%, almost a quarter, were Native American or Indigenous Indians. In the US, we've got less than 10% who are white or had identified themselves as having some other race and ethnicity. We had 27 did not report a gender. So those were missing data, but 38% were female. So you can guess that there were more males in the study in that preschool setting. So parents said, hey, we speak Spanish at home. So that was a requirement for enrollment into the study. And then the students, based on that identification of being L1 is Spanish, or their first home language is Spanish, so we call that L1. If that was Spanish, then we administered it randomly either the English NLM listening form for the preschool level or the Spanish form, right? And then we looked at the reliability and validity evidence. What happened? Well, we found out that there are different outcomes. They should not be interchangeable. So if you are using the Spanish NLM listening forms, then you should use them with learners who might have a higher rate of L1 being Spanish at home. But you need to have them administered by someone who is also a native Spanish speaker. I know there's a bunch of dialects, so that's also important. Someone who speaks Spanish from the Dominican Republic might be very different from someone who speaks Spanish than from, let's say, Ecuador. So yeah, I'm just throwing that out there. But it's a good thing to think about and to take into account if you are the evaluator. Second, it may not be fair to only administer the English only forms when you do have availability. Like with this preschool NLM, the English and Spanish forms are both free to download and use, right? And so you want to take the best out of two. And if their Spanish retail is higher, then that's a true indicator of what they really can do, because they may be more fluent or comfortable and able to demonstrate comprehension in Spanish versus English. So when you can and you have the resources and capabilities to do so, including staffing to administer these and score them, then we would recommend that you use both and take the higher of the two scores. Any questions on this one, Christy? I think I'm in. Two.
Nope, we're good so far.
This one is a relatively new article that came out. There's a lot of words on here because I'm hoping people will use this to tell other folks about it. This is so important. It needs to get more attention, and I believe we have to make sure it's going to be open access, Christy. We have to stay on top of Doug. Okay, here's the problem that we have all over the world. there is the tendency to equate oral reading fluency as a comprehension measure. All right. So take that into account. A bunch of people are using oral reading fluency or ORF. And if the student is identified as not meeting benchmark or the criterion, then they're flagged for reading comprehension issues and potentially, right, decoding issues, like one and the same. But when you don't have another measure of reading comprehension, you're just taking that as it is at face value as a general outcome measure of comprehension, you actually may be under identifying students who might be fluent readers, but they just can't comprehend what it is the heck they're reading, right? So we wanted to look at, I'm not involved in this one. The researchers wanted to look at, if we could look at the correlation between reading fluency and then reading comprehension, like using really good measures of reading comprehension outcomes. They used the MAP, which is a common assessment. The RIT scores were used as the reading comprehension outcome. They also used the cubed, the narrative language measures reading. So the students read the passage, the researchers timed them for a minute, were able to get reading fluency outcomes. And that's what we used as the comparison. And then so reading fluency, the MAP was reading comprehension, and the RETEL, so the narrative language measures reading after they're done reading the story, and then you finish reading the rest of the story to them. You then ask the students, thanks for reading and listening. Now you tell me the exact same story. Try to include as many details as you can in your story. Like, and tell that I've read this bunch. So the student does a retell. Well, that's actually demonstrating comprehension of what it is that they read, right? So that was also used as a reading comprehension outcome measure. They took a look at over 600 students. So 672 to be exact. They looked at second and third graders to rule out any issues with kids in first grade who might be struggling still with decoding aspects. There were a lot of students who, would have been identified as low performers in the oral reading fluency section, but who may have been flagged for reading comprehension. And so they were interested in finding those students and seeing, if we're going to do oral reading fluency and they didn't meet benchmark for that, does it mean that they don't have comprehension skills either? So that was also key indicators. What is the correlation between these three things? Also, if we control for SES. So a lot, more than a third of the students in the sample were identified as having a low socioeconomic status, so SES, and they qualified in the US, we call it for free or reduced lunch. That's one of our indicators of financial need, poverty aspects. And so you've got over a third of them who are in that category that were in the sample. They're mostly white and Hispanic. So take that for what it is. It was in 2 school districts in a Mountain West US state, and I'll show a picture of what that means later for you. Now, all right, what is the outcome? So they're administered the MAP assessment. They're administered the narrative language measures reading 2 stories. So they took the best scores out of the 2. So the NLM retell, right, and the reading fluency. Now for second graders, this goes against everything that people are doing. In second grade, there was very little correlation between a narrative retell task and reading fluency. There's also very little correlation between reading fluency and this adaptive reading task, which is the MAP, which should be another good assessment. It's better than oral reading fluency. So third grade, same. In fact, there's even like a negative correlation, like, polar opposites. We've got 2 magnets and they're like, nope, they're trying to go away from each other. They're not related. So what does this tell us? Well, finally, we have really good paper that's published that's telling people to stop using oral reading fluency as a reading comprehension outcome. We have better measures available. You can use something like the MAP, the RIT scores, or you can use something which is free. If you use the paper pencil forms, the narrative language measures reading or listening both can measure comprehension. You can only get the reading fluency outcome if you're using the NLM reading, which makes sense because you're having the students read the passage. So we need to be using available measures. What makes an evidence-based practice? Well, the best available evidence. And so if the evidence is suggesting that we should not be doing oral reading fluency as a comprehension measure, then we need to stop doing it. And I'm going to be on a soapbox about this year, because I'm going to get after all of my fellow researchers who I know love oral reading fluency and love saying it's correlated with comprehension. But it is, because those oral reading fluency passages are always below grade level. So of course kids understand them more because they're below grade level, and below the type of complex text that students are actually encountering in their grade level curricula, right? So those oral reading fluency assessments are not designed to measure comprehension. End of story. So please share this with school psychologists and teachers and educators. If you want a copy of this paper, you can reach out to Christy and I. You'll get a synopsis. Actually, Christy, can we attach that to the follow-up email?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah. I'm not sure that it's open access yet, so let's do that for sure.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, we'll figure it out.
there you go. Thank you. So that's my goal this year, is that we need to disseminate information about this so people stop using oral reading fluency. All right, questions about that? Anybody? I'm just gonna look at the chat right quick. And I don't see anything. Okay, if you have any questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat and I'll look at that. All right, next section. So cube done. We had 2 studies that we looked at. The diamond research. The diamond was recently came out, right? So I think the end of last year, I think they started shipping out the beginning of this year, 2025. So we're really excited to share with you some information, but there are so many more studies than just this one. I do just want to put a caveat there that things are in the works in review with journals, and who knows, everything about timing is just a matter of when the reviewers are done with their review, and they don't have deadlines. So that's not a soapbox, it's just the truth. All right. This one, first publication about the diamond that came out. We have more data for you about this. I'll get to it at the end of the slides and share that with you. But in this article that recently came out, we looked at a study of 634 diverse 1st through 5th grade students. Some had language disorders, some did not. They were from 9 different elementary schools across rural and urban areas in those Mountain West US states. And so I kind of, to show you what that looks like in this area in general, sometimes, you know, just to make it easy, it's like a little bit of this area over here that's not included in this bracket graphed area. But for those of you not in the US, that's what that looks like. So that's where the sample came from. The method was to administer this dynamic assessment of narrative language, which took about 10 minutes in length, to all the students that were in the sample. So 634 students. And then we looked at, keep saying we, bad habit. Then the researchers, including Christy, who's in our meeting tonight, looked at how can we identify students if they have DLD or developmental language disorder? Like, how good of an assessment is this for identifying such? And they use what's called a triangulation technique. But there are multiple sources of data. What we know is that when you're diagnosing someone with, you know, for eligibility for special education services, especially, you're supposed to have multiple sources of data, right? You don't just take one assessment as is and then run with it. So looking through those multiple sources, everything kind of lined up. And what they found was that this assessment had about a little bit greater than 90% sensitivity and specificity. Okay. Up in the right-hand corner is a snapshot that I have for identifying language disorder across this entire sample. And then we've got, you know, 5-year-olds all the way up through 14-and-a-half-year-olds. The sensitivity and specificity is remarkably great. All right. And then when you look at the multilingual sample, so those are students, again, same age bracket, it's even better. So what we're able to do, and just this one paper showed, is within this particular assessment of the diamond, and there's 4 subtests. So this is just one. This is the dynamic assessment of narrative discourse, so DAND. What you're looking at is that it's a great measure that will help you determine eligibility for special education services under DLD, or go ahead and diagnose in case you need an actual diagnosis. So we also, over time, Chrissy and I have been training folks to get comfortable with the responsiveness scores, or what we call the modifiability scores. So what are the behaviors that the students are exhibiting during that teaching process? All right, so you test, then you teach, then you retest. If you test them and then they don't meet criterion, then you're going to teach them the exact skill that you just tested them on. And how responsive are they to prompts? What is their confidence level like? So all of these indicators are showing that students either are or aren't going to have difficulty learning. You're already in a one-to-one situation, right? So, and the procedures that are used within the diamond for the teaching phases are all evidence-based, like principles of effective instruction, prompting, prompt fading, errorless learning, those kind of things. So we know they work, right? And so if you're using these structured steps and these scripts and following them to a T as an examiner, and the student is still not responsive to your prompts, they're not getting it. That helps us improve the actual sensitivity and specificity of those outcomes, because we need to combine both the pre to post, how'd they do on the pretest, and if they bombed it, and then we test them again after the teaching phase. So not just how much did they learn from pretest to post-test in that one sitting, in that 10-minute block, right? But what was it like for them to learn, right? And so many people are, feel icky. I know as a behavior analyst, I could operationalize the heck out of a lot of those responsiveness, like modifiability targets, but that's not the point. It's a general assumption, and you as an examiner or evaluator, how difficult is it based on your perception for that student to learn? And it works. So I hope that this takes up. Dynamic assessment is amazing. And then in July, we will have a free webinar about dynamic assessment. So make sure to stay tuned to our social media and sign up for that one. All right, any questions about this one? We will get into.
We had a quick question. I can go ahead and answer this one actually, but it's about the other sources of data that were used for the triangulation technique, other typical language batteries. So it's I know we used parent concern and teacher concern were evaluated for the student, as well as if they actually had an IEP qualification for language. We also did an analysis of a language sample. In addition to that, I think there was one or two others, but off the top of my head, from what I'm remembering from us carrying out the study, those were the main ones that we evaluated in addition to the assessment.
Yeah. I can't remember if it was like a self or anything else, but I don't think so.
I don't think so.
Awesome. Okay. All right, moving on to the first word for your certificate. In order to receive a certificate for this webinar, you will have to enter in 2 words. The first word is going to be open access. So make sure you write that down, so when you go to the certificate at the end of the webinar, you can answer that correctly. All right. Story Champs research. So the remainder of the webinar tonight will be focused on the research that has gone on and has been published about first the Story Champs, what exists now. So we call it Story Champs 2.0. Folks have asked before, what does a 2.0 mean? Did you come out with something new? No, we didn't. A long time ago, Story Champs was published where you could buy separately the large group lesson plans and materials, the small group, and the one-to-one, right? And so if you were just an interventionist, you did one-to-one, you'd only get that. But the system was set up by Trita and Doug to be implemented within MTSS, right? Multi-tiered systems of supports. And so students were supposed to be getting this at tier 1, not just kids who are receiving intervention, but everybody needs this. And so then that's when things became 2.0, because the Blitz stories were added at that time. So this was many years ago. I feel like 2013. I don't know. So don't get, I might mention 2.0 again, but nothing is new. I'm sure all of you have that one. Now, we also are looking at, because the large group, because Story Champs as it is right now, is mostly used by interventionists. There are some schools and school districts and preschools that are getting word and like kind of excited about it and seeing the progress because of speech language pathologists who are sharing it or pushing into classrooms. We've been working on since I think the first studies were taking place 2017, 2018, in Story Champs curriculum. Now, what that will entail are these lessons where day 1, you work on story retell, day 2, story writing, day 3, info retell, day 4, so like Thursday, information writing, and day 5, the lesson is up to teacher choice as to what do they think that they need to work on. And they can do center rotations, or they can do a large group lesson. Now, this is going to be the Story Champs curriculum. This is what it's going to entail. It's going to be fully manualized, like boom, manual in hand. What we've found also with Story Champs as the intervention kit kind of like exists now is that people don't realize that there's lesson plans in the digital downloads. So they just kind of pick it up and use the storybook and the illustrations and then icons, but they don't know what they're doing. They're not following the procedures that we have in research. So we've learned that lesson as implementation scientists. So we are going to be publishing that manualized program for Gen Ed at Tier 1. Okay. Then I will get us through to the Story Champs AAC expansion pack. And we have a study that came out right as we were publishing or making available this tool. So I'll share with you the results of that. All right. I know, visually aggressive. I'm sorry, but there's a lot of information here. So I was a part of the research team. This came out actually 2025. It didn't say 2023, but 2025. So this year, it was published, and we looked at what if in preschool there were Head Start classrooms. So this is our low income free public preschool type programs. And so it's kids with and without disabilities in it, mostly without. We would call them probably at-risk students because of poverty or some other things going on. So that's the context, right? In the preschool setting, the teachers were delivering large group lessons, right? And on days that large group lessons were not implemented, teachers or teacher assistants implemented either a Spanish or an English small group lesson, right? And there are about 3 students in a group. So I believe it was like 3 days of large group and then maybe like 1 or 2 days that they received a small group during literacy center rotation. So that's in the preschool setting. We wanted to investigate the extent to which maybe family engagement activities could help boost, 1, the connection between home and school, and 2, would it have any impact on improving the students' oral language skills as measured in school? All right, so if families were doing these activities, did the students' language improve? We looked at this over 6 to 8 weeks. So if you think about it, that's 2 months max. It's a very brief amount of time, but preschoolers learn quickly. Young kids, quick learners. And I just want to point out, like, the large group lessons were only 12 to 15 minutes. They were very brief and quick, so that they fit well into the daily schedules in the Head Start classroom. The family engagement activities, or the FEAs, I'm going to call them, involved this. So like we would have a 1-pager that was sent home, but there was a packet of them stapled together. And they would have a story that, and they would have instructions for the parent of, what questions to ask. And they targeted vocabulary. There are 2 vocabulary words that were targeted in every lesson. A research assistant went to the home of every family who enlisted and enrolled and participated in the study. And there were, I believe, yes, 33 caregiver child dyads. So 33 caregivers and each one had 1 child. There's also a control group who didn't get the FEAs. So they just received the Story Champs in their classrooms. We looked at, the ones who got the family engagement activities, how much did it cost? Like in addition to Story Champs, how much did it cost? And on top of that, was there any benefit to it? Or if not, then we don't need to have that extra cost, right? So it's a very like icky thing to think about, but we did it. So it took about under 12 and a half minutes for a family, a caregiver to implement one of these worksheets after school, right? And they would follow the steps. The parents or caregivers, sometimes there's a grandma, found them very enjoyable. They were easy to use. Obviously, they have to be literate. And so that's going to be a barrier if there's any issues with literacy. But they liked them. They fit into the family schedule. They thought they were effective for their kids. They really like them because most studies where you have caregiver activities and they're very hands-off, in other words, I give you a packet, please do them, they're going to have low participation rates because there's no accountability for it, right? And these families, it was almost 99% completion rate of all of these activities. The research assistant went to the home to train every single one of these 33 families in how to implement and use them, but then also went back, like watched the caregiver run an activity and made sure there was fidelity, and then went back 3 other times. So they liked it. They were doing it. Now, at the end of these 6 weeks, then there was an assessment done. And we used the narrative language measures, listening, Spanish, and vocabulary forms. Okay. And we also used, so like vocabulary measure also on the top vocabulary that was covered in the FEAs. What we found was, everybody who got the tier 1 instruction improved significantly on both their English and their Spanish retells. But the FEAs, or family engagement activities, are the only thing that actually boosted significantly Spanish vocabulary. Not English, well, because they also weren't written in English. So there was not an additive effect, but there was a boost and a larger effect on Spanish vocabulary, which is great because it honors the family's home language. And it means that the caregivers did have a positive impact on their students' learning. It was huge. And it was significant. So what does this mean? Well, in the state of things, if you live in the US, our education budgets are going to be going down as we lose like federal funding for states. So states are not going to compensate for that loss of funding unless they're going to raise your taxes. And no one wants that. So what's going to happen is we're going to have limited money. And we argue that for one standard deviation of improvement, which seems like nothing, but it's a huge mark. If you have preschool students who are at risk and you want them to enter kindergarten with a leg up, when the system is really got a lot of barriers in place and they're not going to get Spanish home activities, right? Then it's going to cost about $261, almost $262 US. This was 2018 estimates, I believe. Yes. Southeast US prices. So it'd probably be about like $270 right now. In that, it might seem like a lot to spend on a child. It is not. The cost of any improvement for any kind of intervention ranges between normally $4,000 to like $40,000. So there's interventions that are published where there are cost analyses and like how much does it cost to get a research assistant to the home? We priced everything, like phone calls and the time it took for the research assistant to call or email and like what were we paying them? That kind of thing. So it was very important for us to look at that, and it was huge. And so when we have limited budgets, things like these family engagement activities that are in the family's home language are going to be really critical to helping us make sure that kids are going to enter kindergarten prepared and with a leg up, and ready. So the kindergarten readiness. All right. Another preschool study just published. It's just only available online. So if you want a copy of it, you can email us. I believe it's behind a paywall. Studies, by the way, they cost about $3,000 to make free for you. They cost the researchers $3,000 to make sure that you don't have to pay for like $50 to read the article. They never pay us for publishing it, by the way. So journals make so much money. So if you can't find this online and it's behind a paywall, please email us and we'll get you a copy. You can always email authors that are on the research papers. There's always an email contact information. Authors love sending you their copy. It's a good way to reach out to them because then they know you're reading it too. It's reinforcement. Now, this particular study was done by our friend, Dr. David Redfield. And while he was, I believe it was in Oklahoma, he started a half-day preschool program for students who are at risk of reading difficulties or disabilities. And all of the students in this preschool half-day program on the university campus had communication disorders. So he co-founded this program. While the students were there, he was like, both all of these students need help in all of the strands of the reading rope, right? And it would be most efficient if teachers could just do one lesson and include phonological awareness, and we worked on narratives. So he's a big believer in story champs and narrative intervention. And so he developed on his own, he added a phonological awareness component to the beginning and the end of his master lesson plan number 23 for story champs. So that's a small group lesson plan. It's like the first one, it's basic story retell. In the first 2.5 minutes of the lesson, and it was always like a 20-minute lesson, like specifically, first 2.5 minutes, they reviewed, I believe, 5 words, excuse me. So 5 words were picked out from the story that was going to be read that day in Story Champs. And then he picked 10 syllables that were going to be targeted for that phonological awareness targeted instruction. After that 2.5 minutes, then, I mean, they worked on like syllable blending, right? So then he went into the Story Champs lesson plan, and it was 3 to 4 students, and that only took 15 minutes. And at the last 2.5 minutes, he wrapped up and he did a review of the PA activity, the phonological awareness activity. He collected data on the students' retells, and like, their use of like sound blending, syllable blending skills outside of this lesson. He did not collect data. And I love this because we always tell folks, do not collect data during Story Champs intervention sessions. You should be using errorless teaching procedures, meaning you should be prompt fading and not letting them get things wrong just for the sake of a plus or minus. So please assess using some other thing and not Story Champs stories. Don't poison the well. Well, he followed that. He found that, when students were read a novel storybook by the teacher in the storybook centers, and they were asked to retell that story, they greatly increased their story grammar. All right. He also administered the narrative language measures listening in the preschool level form. And for the vocabulary, for the storybooks, since there isn't one, like we don't know what storybooks were read, he made a modified retell rubric that followed the same story grammar for narrative discourse complexity. And students increased, which is crazy. Like, this is great. There was only 2 sessions a week for 12 weeks. So 3 months, twice a week. That's it. In a small group. So it wasn't even 1-to-1. And students' retell scores and inclusion of story grammar increased by almost 5 points, which that's a lot for, 4-year-old, right? The mean age was 53 months. He didn't see any increase, and this makes sense because the lesson plan doesn't target it, but in the word or sentence level complexity, meaning their use of because, so that, when, after, before, those key targets for sentence complexity, as well as vocabulary complexity, that did not increase. But the lesson plan that was being used for Story Champs was just on story retell. So there was really no generative incidental effect on that level. So they need more targeted instruction in that. But what about that 2.5-minute block of instruction and 2.5 minutes of review of phonological awareness? Well, half of those students made moderate to large gains in word blending. So as this goes, it is really great that if someone has an existing delivery model, they only have 15 to 20 minutes twice weekly. They need to teach both phonological awareness and narrative discourse, so using narrative intervention. They can do it in a 20-minute block. You've got a really more robust intervention package. Early childhood educators, speech and language pathologists, you can do this and you don't need an increase in cost. Right? You don't have to buy 2 different programs. You can embed this. So if you want more information about those phonological awareness activities, it is in the article and he describes them more. So if you want to add those to your existing practice, please do. All right, moving on to the next one. Chrissy, do we have any comments or questions?
Yeah, we actually did have a question. I think it was about the previous study where it's asking if with the triad stuff to the parents if it had been looked into for kindergarten and grade 1 age students, because we were mainly looking
For
at
the
preschool for that study.
family engagement
Yes.
activities.
Hmm.
No, we didn't look at that. Doesn't mean that we haven't or we are not currently. So
Great.
there's a study that's like in review about that, but no, nothing to
So
share.
stay tuned.
Yes, that's kind of like the answer I'm giving. I'm always hesitant like how long it's going to take for the reviewers to publish it. But it's good. It's not rejected. So, all right. Okay, let's talk about just narrative language and language comprehension in general, right? Children, we know, produce and understand language many years before they're reading and writing. So, and when we build that up, they're prepared for this increase in language demands in the school setting because they've had lots of opportunities to listen to and practice similarly complex oral language from an early age, right? The quantity and quality of the language nutrition that you receive in birth through 8 predicts how well you're going to do in high school. Just, it is true. Unfortunately, when you look at the NAEP or National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is our US test for reading in 4th grade, we continue to decline. I believe, I mean, it's just sad. So 2/3, it's over 2/3 now, like over 60% of students are not performing as expected on these reading comprehension assessments in 4th grade or 8th grade. But if, almost, I always say this, if you've got so many students who are failing that exam, not all of them have decoding problems. Maybe 15% do. But that means that you have all of these other students where it's not decoding or word recognition. It's not fluency, oral reading fluency. That's not going to be helping. It's this deficit in language comprehension. Now, what we're doing in the classroom, and I'll be the first to say I was a part of the problem when I was a classroom teacher. What we're doing is not working. Our classroom teaching methods have not improved sufficiently enough to meet these reading curriculum standards, these grade level expectations. We know that some programs, they have major focus on developing background knowledge and vocabulary, right? And they do one or the other, maybe both. And the intent is to improve reading comprehension, but those two approaches alone are not enough to make a meaningful impact, and help kids be able to read proficiently in 4th grade. Storybook reading and a focus on background knowledge is not enough. So repeated book reading is going to teach kids to memorize and to give you the answers that you've been asking. It does not teach students to the language that they need to demonstrate comprehension of a novel story read, just the story that you read to them, right? And so we need to kind of think about what can we do instead of this repeated storybook reading that we thought was working on comprehension as teachers. I hear it all the time. Oh, I already do that. I read stories a lot. It does not make narrative instruction. So this is a great publication. Came out at the end of last year, and it was a 3-arm randomized control trial. But basically, you've got a randomized control trial where there's 3 different conditions. All right. One condition in this bottom left here is that it was structured literacy, aka story champs. So the second condition that students or classrooms rather could be randomized to was just shared storybook intervention, which dialogic reading. Right. So known intervention that's got evidence base in early primary years. So birth through preschool. And then you've got a no treatment control, meaning it was business as usual. The classroom just used whatever English language arts curriculum that they had, right? That the district gave them or whatever. So it's supposed to be good since the district bought it, one would think. So there are 270 students. There's 686 students, but 270 were pulled into one of these conditions. And if they were assigned to the story champs condition, the structured literacy condition, what happened was SLPs were actually given a 4-hour training in the implementation of story champs within MTSS, or multi-tier system of language supports, MTSLS. We add that acronym, the L, because we think language deserves to be front and center, and people, when they see reading, only think about reading fluency. So MTSLS. So they got 4 hours Then the SLPs, after this training, went into the schools and they went into the classrooms that were assigned to this condition, and they modeled for the teachers the large group lessons. They observed the teachers during their first session implementing the lesson. So they observed the teachers, gave them feedback. They also gave them fidelity checklists to use to make sure that they could follow the same steps that the SLPs had shown them. And then the SLPs checked in on them 3 additional times during the study and gave feedback and coaching as needed. So the SLPs didn't push in and continue to deliver the lessons. They trained, they modeled, and then gave the reins to the classroom teacher, which is the way it should be. So all students in that classroom, if they were assigned to that structured literacy condition, they're receiving tier 1 story champs instruction, right? And progress monitoring tools were used for the first 4 weeks. And by the end of that first month of this tier 1 instruction, kids that still had low scores at pretest and then continuously at that weekly progress monitoring, tier 1 was not enough. So then they were assigned to receive additional tier 2 instruction, and the SLP delivered that. Usually within the classroom, they didn't pull them. They're not students with speech language disorders per se, right? So they pushed into the classroom, had a small table, usually that you table in the back of the classroom or something. And at a different time than the tier 1 instruction, they got supplemental small group instruction. So they got a second dose, right? So an increased dosage of story champs. In the classrooms where it was the shared storybook intervention, the teachers were given storybooks and then dialogic questions, WH questions to ask, maybe prediction questions, so on and so forth. Now, what happened by the end of the study? So there were, I think it was 14 weeks, right? So about 14 weeks, and then 10 weeks if they got tier 2 instruction on top of that. There's 10 weeks of that. Here are the results. Guess what? This is not a surprise. Structured literacy intervention for language using story champs had strong effects on both oral narrative and expository, so information retell at tier 1. So the students got all of it. They all improved in both of those things. For students that were identified at risk for reading comprehension difficulties that needed that tier 2, they had even higher gains. Stronger effects were seen there because they needed it, the supplemental extra dose. So if they had difficulty with language learning, tier 2 intervention helped address those needs. Shared storybook reading did not result overall in significant outcomes when compared to the no treatment business as usual condition, yet we keep doing it. So the shared storybook is this yellow, and the control, which is business as usual, it actually does business as usual is better than shared storybook reading. So for all my teachers out there that say that they read stories and they ask questions and it's very engaging, stop. You can do it. Maybe read a different story every day, but you need to have procedures that are structured, and you need to use stories that are meant for specific aspects of language learning. So story retell or sentence complexity or vocabulary. They need to be written with specific purposes, and you need to have a lesson plan for your storybook reading. All right. Questions there, Christy?
Yes, we do have one in the Q&A that said how many students that came up to tier 2 once a week with SLP support needed to move to tier 3 support, and then how many returned down to tier 1?
So at this right here, none of them needed tier 3. So at the end of that 14 weeks or 10 weeks of small group, none of them were at the high risk level where it would have warranted some diagnosis and like intervention special education services. So all of these students, it was a prevention model.
Awesome. That's it.
Okay. Which is great. But again, it doesn't mean by the end of the year they weren't identified, but in that 10 weeks of tier 2, no one actually needed to be bumped up to tier 3. They would have been referred anyway, but yeah. Okay. Visual aggressive. So, let's look again. So this is first grade. This is Story Champs curriculum. The graphs don't get overwhelmed, they look crazy, but it's like a pre-test and post-test. That's what we were connecting. We used what's called a repeated acquisition design. It's a single case research design. It's awesome, but basically like if we looked at vocabulary words that were targeted explicitly within the Story Champs curriculum lessons. The Story Champs curriculum itself in this first grade, this is an early publication about it. We have another one that's in the works for first graders as well. So that's a randomized control trial. This was not. So we looked at, using the Story Champs curriculum. The first strand was like, hey, we're gonna have lessons that focus on retells using these target vocabulary words that are embedded within the story. And then we had them extend practice of using those vocabulary words to personal storytelling or additional like center-based activities, right? Or writing activities. But every lesson, the students worked on between 8 and 10 times, they worked on each of those words. And I believe that there are 4 words. Yes, 4 words. The lessons happened twice a week and they targeted about 48 total words. Now, what did we get? Took a pre-test at the beginning of the week, then did the lessons, so twice a week. And so twice a week, we worked on those targeted lessons. And at the end of the week, we did a post-test on the same words. So at the pre-test, we would assume that they did not know these words. And then at the post-test, we assumed that if intervention was working, or instruction rather was working, that they would increase. This looked at specifically 22 out of, there were over 150 students and engaged or enrolled in this randomized control trial that is not included here. But 22 of these first graders, they were not making any progress on the beginning of the year benchmark for the NLM listening. Their score is really low. And so immediately, rather than wait, they were identified for that tier 2 supports, that supplemental intervention. And that intervention went for 12 weeks. So over the course of 12 weeks, we really did look at, like, do kids learn from these embedded activities, like structured, explicit vocabulary instruction embedded into narrative intervention? So Story Champs lesson. And then does that knowledge maintain or retain over time? And the answer was yes. They always had a higher score. Like 13 weeks later, at the 13th week or 14th week, they were given a like mass retest on all the words that they were exposed to. And we compared and contrasted the retention skill or retention scores to, like, week 1 was a long time away from week 13. Did they still retain knowledge of that vocabulary, even though they never exposed to those words again in the Story Champ story? And the answer was yes, always above baseline. So it was significant. What I would take away from this is we do not need to pre-teach vocab. End of story. So if you're teaching vocab explicitly using a Story Champs lesson plan for vocabulary, then you do not need to waste time, setting aside time before Story Champs lesson to explicitly teach that vocabulary. They learn it better within the context or contextualized intervention, as we know. So, all right. Whoops. Getting to the end. Next one, it was one of the first studies for dual language, Spanish, English, bilingual students. They're in 3rd grade and they all have DLD. The takeaway from this one, it was a very small study. It ended up having to be online because of COVID. And then any of you have tried to do online virtual sessions for therapy and try to fit that into family schedules, you know that that can be a barrier. So the aim of the researchers was to have 3 sessions a week. The average amount of sessions that they ended up getting out of the families was 1.79 sessions. So there was a high level of like cancellations. And so the responding, I put bars here to show you, like, sometimes they only had 1 session a week. Other times they had 3. So it was very variable, 2 sessions a week. And it took a lot longer. They were only supposed to have 4 weeks of intervention. And it ended up going into like 6, 7, 8. What they found, they did only 12 days of intervention. That's it. When they mean by days, they mean like the actual online virtual sessions. So only 12 virtual lessons. Average amount of time, they said, a research assistant who was an undergraduate or graduate student for master's program, they were trained in the procedures to implement Story Champs. It was a double episode retell lesson plan. They only spent the first 3 sessions just working on story grammar, even though the students were so low. They moved on quickly. Then they did 2 sessions of causal connections, 2 2 sessions of temporal, 2 sessions of modifiers, and then they had 3 sessions to review things. So very quick. They didn't stay in any one particular lesson plan because of progress monitoring showing that the kid needed more lessons in that lesson plan. They just kept going on and on and on. They were following the quick start guide for low language learners. What we recommend is that you don't move on based on that. You need to progress monitor. And if you need to stay longer in a specific lesson plan, you should until proficiency is mastered. So all the students, they had difficulties showing, they all improved overall in story grammar, but there was not a significant improvement in linguistic complexity in 12 sessions. In fact, not even 12, there was only 9 sessions where that might have been targeted or reviewed. They also found that the dosage is too low. These are older students where progress is slower and steadier, and they have significant needs. And so you're going to need more sessions, and it needs to be more consistent. And you probably need more sessions at these specific lessons and not move on so quickly. All right, I'm going to go through this really quickly. New study came out that was a systematic review of AAC interventions that work on things other than requesting and tacting. So it's what interventions are out there to promote commenting. That came out. Here are the results. But what came out of that afterwards was in this study, after Trina, Nora was her doc student at the time, and Matt Foster at USF, they did a study in which they had 3 students who were all AAC users. There's information there about the participants. They used the new Story Champs AAC expansion pack. And what that involved was doing a story retell with the regular, modeling the regular story. So this would be like the regular story here. And then you model the story using the student's AAC device, using the simplified story. So you don't have to program Tina, like the name and stuff. And then there's 3 targets. It's always a noun, a verb, and an adjective, right? And those are the targets that you're trying to get the student to transfer stimulus control to do independently. Those are your goals. There were a total of 9 to 12 intervention sessions over 4 to 5 weeks, 2 to 4 sessions a week in the students' homes. It was after school, about 30 minutes a session, and the interventionist was an SLP. Here are the results. Increased use of story grammar during retells, slowly but surely, right? Warm probes means practice, cold is like novel. So both go up. Then also, this is the cool part, there was an increase in multi-symbol, utterances. So they increased to a use of 2 to 4 symbols per sentence, just in 9 to 12 sessions and at home. The families and SLPs at school even reported, and teachers reported expanded number of symbols used daily, increased frequency and proficiency of AAC use. The students initiated AAC with multiple conversational partners. They transferred new symbols learned in the context of retells to requests and other communicative functions, right? They started telling personal stories spontaneously, and then parents wanted to keep the materials and also wanted the schools to buy, like one family was like, I want my school SLP to do it. So the takeaway is like 9 to 10 sessions, that's it. Participants made huge significant gains in story retell multi-symbol use. Those are prerequisite skills for communicative functions like personal storytelling, which we need these students who are most at risk for abuse to be able to tell their own stories, right? The parents loved it and they were going to sustain. So anyway, this article is great. It's open access. You can Google it too, and download it, but this has huge promise. I encourage you to read it because it will give you more information about how to use the Story Champs AAC expansion pack. And that brings us to the final code word. It's research practice partnership. Okay. Research practice partnership is the second and final word for your certificate. And then here are some takeaways. If you're interested in the diamond research, we have way more published. We're like open access as to like what's going on behind the scenes. There's a QR code. You can get the latest research in the summary and a breakdown of all the participants that we've had from across the world in that research to try to get diamond out and like the best it can be. Also, COVID norms. Diamond research was going on during COVID and after. I'm not really sure it's done. Also, Story Champs. It works. So does Cubed. Cube should be used instead of oral reading fluency. And last but not least, here is your webinar certificate. So you can access the webinar certificate here. The link is also in the chat. And Christy, do we have any questions? Let's see.
We just had one more about any studies being conducted for upper elementary students to show positive generalized effects for story champs. So story champs in the classroom for upper elementary.
No, we do not. We have only gone up to third grade because tier 1, so story champs as a curriculum is only up to tier 1 is only up to third grade because in fourth grade, the standards go to, they should already do this stuff. So we have not, there are studies and the research, there's QR codes. There are studies with like high schoolers, right? A student with Down syndrome who's also bilingual Spanish English speaker. There's also third, fourth graders, but those are interventions. So in terms of third grade, that's as far as our research has gone. If anybody is interested in doing any research, that is my jam. Christy and I are here to help you. So you can send us an email at training@languagedynamicsgroup.com and respond. And if you're like, hey, I have this question, or I have this idea, it's our job to help you figure that out and try to make it as easy as possible for you, creating data sheets or helping you learn the ropes or what to do, not to do. And yes, Veronica, open access is the first one. Okay. All right. So that's it for our webinar. Thank you so much for joining. Feel free to reach out to us at any time. And then we're also on Facebook and Instagram. It's at Language Dynamics, plural, Dynamics Group, singular. And that's our handle. And you can find information about webinars, products. We've got reels, all of these things, how-tos, old webinars. So thank you so much for your time. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your week and take care. We'll hopefully see you next month.